name is William Kilbride. Kurt has kindly invited me to chair this final session, which is really more of a roundtable and discussion to take us through some of the issues and perhaps more importantly, rather than simply repeating or questioning in more detail the topics we've heard about already, perhaps slightly more usefully to explore what themes might usefully be taken forward and in some senses develop a bit of a plan or some thoughts about what we should do next. I should introduce myself a little bit insofar as I work for this shadowy little organisation called the Digital Preservation Coalition, which Kurt mentioned at the start. We're a membership organisation, and if you're interested, in collaborating around these issues of digital preservation, then come and speak to me afterwards. It would be great to do so. Anyway, we should start by introducing. Maybe I could ask each of the panel just very briefly to introduce themselves. We'll start with Martien, who's already been introduced, but you're none of the people on the board. Just to start with that observation, Dylan.
Hi, I'm Dylan Evans. I'm the Head of Systems and Services here at the British Architectural Library at the RIBA. I've got sort of I'm going to say checkered history, but I've started off as a librarian, worked for about 10 years in IT, and then I've come back to being a librarian.
I'm Alex Tait. I work in the practice department here at the RIBA. Within the research team, my main output most recently was the RIBA plan of work, and I work with Stuart, who's just spoken, and Jeff, who's just about to say hello, on the Uniclass project that was mentioned earlier.
I'm Geoffrey Makstutis. I am the course leader of the undergraduate architecture course at Central St. Martin's. I have been a practicing architect in the past, but I'm primarily an educator and a researcher now. And as Alex has said, we've collaborated on the Building Information Gateway project and continue to look at some research related to building information modeling.
Okay, so the point of this discussion is to brainstorm ideas for the future, or areas where we think there's weaknesses or strengths that we should exploit. So I'm just going to kick off by saying, for me, just reflecting on the experience of today so far, I'd like to propose 3 areas of work for us to consider, either now or in the future. And this is just my instinctive response to today. There may be others that other people want to call out, so please don't think of this as the agenda for the discussion. This is just some thoughts from my observations today. Number 1. We've had a series of really great projects presented to us. I'm struck by the Facade project, Facade 2, as well. And there's obviously interesting work to be done in a collaborative way between projects and between institutions, between quite unlikely parts of institutions perhaps. That's obvious in Facade 2. It's also obvious in the Gaudi project. So the question arises, what sort of collaborations should we be thinking of? What sorts of activities should we be thinking of next? What should we be thinking of next? What is the successor to the Gaudi initiative? What are the successors to the Facade project that we might want to engage in or be involved in or support in a variety of different ways? And there are opportunities for funding which in turn we could exploit. My second observation is about the need to engage a diverse community. And that diverse community, it kind of follows on from the previous thought, but it relates to, first of all, how do archivists work with, in principle, how do they work with architects and architectural practices? How do we work with IT departments? IT departments are the dog that hasn't barked, I think, in the workshop so far. We actually all have IT departments, many of whom have no idea what we're talking about when we talk to them about archiving for reasons that Geoffrey gave us. And Stuart, you'll notice, gave a paper and then ran away. And I heard sirens over the coffee break there, so I'm wondering if these things are connected. How do we work with diverse communities? How do we work with students? I'm interested to know your perspectives on that from Central St. Martin. What skills do we need to give students, both students of architecture, but also students in archival schools or information management posts? What skills do they need to have imparted to them? My third observation comes back to the question I asked a little before lunch, and which I think we were beginning to get into in Stuart's presentation right at the end there, which is about the future. What was great about the diagram, the now familiar, what's the origin of it again, the BIM diagram with the wedge?
Yeah, the Buse-Richards.
Buse-Richards diagram. I've forgotten its name already. But the Buse-Richards diagram, what's great about that is actually it points to the future. You know, it says, here are things which will be coming. And we know of other things that are coming our way, broadly. We know of the growth of data in our archives. Remember, there are three axes of growth for all data. There's the axis of sheer scale, so that's the expectation that by 2020 there'll be 44 times more data in our respective repositories than there is now. Second axis of growth is complexity. So whereas previously we were managing relatively self-contained files, we're looking at more integrated components, whereas in the past there was, you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was convergence around a relatively small number of platforms. There is now a proliferation of computing platforms, as can be seen just by the range of technology on the desk in front of us. Third axis of growth, pointed to by the Buse-Richards diagram, but not only there, is the axis of importance and expectation. So even if it wasn't getting more complex, even if it wasn't growing in scale, the expectations we have of our data continue to grow. So it seems to me that within those three big topics, there's all sorts of directions of travel that we as a group might choose to take, or which anyone in the room might choose to take. But that's my opportunity to stop speaking, and remember, it's my job to not do the discussion, but to chair the discussion, and that's where I'm going to stop. So I wonder if I can invite anyone else in the room either to add to that list of three things, or to refine any of those very crude points into something meaningful and sharp and incisive.
I wonder if I could
Geoffrey,
pick up on your first point, which is the one about collaboration. I think it's worth remembering, coming from Stuart's presentation, that building information modeling represents quite a radical shift in the relationship between data and project. And I often think of it as actually it's not about a model. It's a proxy for a set of relationships between different practices, different participants, and so on. And then if you're going to start archiving that information, we need to start to think about how do you archive relationships? How do you represent those relationships? There's been a lot of talk today about trying to reveal the process that leads to these things. Well, much of that information gets stored in building information modeling in relatively coded ways. Yeah? But it's quite revealing when one knows how to read it. So how do we start to think about ways of capturing that information, holding on to it, recognizing all the challenges about the distributed nature of it, but then also what does it represent? It isn't just it's a building. There's something much more to it than that. The other thing that I think comes from it is the fact that, as Stuart mentioned, the building information model is no longer purely a device that gets you from the start of a design process to handover. It's intended to continue into the life cycle of the building.
Yes.
It is a live set of data. So you have to start to make decisions about what is it that you're archiving. Are you archiving a snapshot at the point at which it is built? Or are you going to accept that the building continues to live and change, and the model will reflect that change? And therefore, are you archiving live data? And discussions that were brought up earlier about some of the legal implications of this, that adds a whole layer of complexity into it. So I think it's important to recognize that the shift from CAD to BIM isn't just one about more data. It's a fundamentally different relationship between data and what the data represents.
Martien, have you all even had an experience with any elements of BIM?
Yeah.
How are you? What have you had any initial?
No.
Initial thoughts? That's fine.
No, we're in the process of because actually Cas Oosterhuis, who has donated the muscle to CCA, let's say the digital file, is the only thing that's left of this project. I don't know if you're familiar with the project that was shown in the non-standard show in the Pompidou, but and it's about this skin that moves up and down. But he is actually really far in also remodeling the BIM. I have to say that for CCA, and particularly in this stage, these projects that we're collecting now, as I said before, are really the experimental projects. So let's say BIM is a kind of also standardization of the building or the design process, which I understand completely, and also let's say there is a financial drive too for doing that, which could actually be also a drive for cultural institutions. But let's say besides these 25 projects, we also receive larger archives that are more, let's say, that we acquired for different reasons, but not because they were so experimental in terms of digital. For example, we acquired the Abalos and Herreros archive from Madrid, and we did not acquire that archive because they were super experimental in terms of digital, but for other reasons. But they also did send us 2 hard drives, but let's say, in that on these hard drives there is kind of initial BIM models integrated in the process. We harvested these hard drives and we're kind of working on it, but we're not yet that far to work really on the BIM models. But it really depends on what you're in as institution. If you're interested in, let's say, capturing the normalization or the standardization of design processes, or if you're interested in other parts of the design process, I think. But let's say as a model, because I was also thinking, in another way about it, apart from collecting projects have been modeled within BIM, because they will come, of course, to all of us, right. All of our institutions. We will, and I mean now I'm talking to Autodesk, for example, and to Geoffrey Technologies about how to deal with all the problems that they have given us. But and for sure, at some point, if you collect, you will start to talk with producers from BIM as well. But what I think also, let's say, as a model for let's say cultural institutions, you can also think about it. Because it also tells you, the example of Facade 2, even if it's complicated to collaborate with 2 institutions, it is not easy in the BIM model either to collaborate, to get everyone on the same page and to get everyone in the building process. But I think, let's say, as a kind of an intellectual model, it's an interesting model for us too. And I think actually the Gaudi project is a very good example too, that let's say, one of the issues that David brought up at lunch was that the difference in languages within the Gaudi project was let's say very, very complicated to actually make it very successful, apart from all kind of other issues. But that is an issue, of course, and once you start to communicate in another kind of language, so let's say there are 2 ways to think about it.
Can I kind of ask a follow-up question, which I'm happy any of the panel really to take it up. So if I was an archivist hearing that, I've just sorted out what I might possibly do with CAD, and I'm not entirely sure about that either, and I come to this event and I discover people are now talking about BIM, what on earth is BIM, I would be horrified, There would be a natural reaction of, oh my goodness. And then there would also be a bit of scepticism that said, well, no one's really going to do that anyway, are they? But we have all the regulations that say it is coming, unfortunately. But really my question is this: should I be scared of that? Or, and this is where my own understanding might be helpful or might be helped, actually, if BIM is doing a lot of this metadata and doing a lot of this linking for us, isn't it actually going to be easier to do stuff in the context of properly worked out building information modelling than it would be just with a series of standalone CAD files? It's a ridiculous aspiration, I'm sure it's not, but would others like to comment on that?
I'll jump in. I think that should exactly be the case. So Stuart mentioned earlier that level 3 BIM, which was the point after that red line, is up for grabs. It's still up for grabs. So the UK BIM task group is the government supported in some way, but completely industry led. So no one doing any work is being paid by government. It's all industry. So this is not just for government work. Eventually, it will filter down to everything else. But they are not defining what level 3 is yet. They will be doing that in the next year or so.
Yep.
Which means there is a really good opportunity for archiving to be a part of that. At the moment, it's not. There's a whole load of different BIM for groups. There's BIM for facilities management, which is good to hear some people talking about that, as well as BIM for retail, BIM for anything else, really. But there isn't one for archiving, and there should be.
Well,
I'm also critical, to be honest, because I understand what you're saying, but I think what it's really about, let's say for archiving, you select what you want to archive.
Yeah.
So in this case, let's say, and this is only for the UK, BIM is going to be necessary for project over 5 million, if I understand. So what if you, as a smaller archive, want to collect projects that have not even been built? You know, they're not because it's not about, we're not archiving the built environment. Not all of us, let's say. Some of us do, but not all of us. So it's really about what is your objective? What would you like to? Let's say I could have. I mean, if I wanted to make my job at the CCI easy, I would never, ever, ever, ever acquire these 25 projects, because those are the most complicated ones you can imagine.
Yes.
So let's say. In terms of, so it really depends on what your objective is.
I mean, there's a paradox. I mean, we already, Alex mentioned earlier about some of the science data, and there's a paradox, I think, in the e-science world that big projects are easy to archive, and small projects are easy to archive, but the majority of science isn't big and it isn't small, it's somewhere in the middle, and they neither have the proper resource to do true risk management, nor are they small enough to be just done on an afternoon. So there's maybe that's a risk with BIM.
Well, I think you have to recognise that it isn't just the UK that's pushing BIM forward. You know, it's quite heavily coming out of the States as well, and it's likely that that £5 million cap that they've put on it at the moment will come down over time, and you will get to the point where anything that gets public funding will have to use BIM. I think you're also going to see the fact that once the schools start to teach BIM as a part of the curriculum, and it does happen, you know, Northumbria has got the BIM Institute, which is pushing that forward in education quite strongly. But I think once you start to see students learning BIM rather than CAD, which I think is probably inevitable, it will trickle out into smaller practices as well. And I think that the potential then is that, yes, the archivist will still be choosing the projects that they want, choosing the aspects of projects that they want, but it may make the process easier because, you know, that sort of automated process of your SIPs coming in, some of that can be much more effective because the model itself, the data will have more information associated with it, and that will help to put it to where you need it to be.
Gentlemen, a couple of rows back.
Thank you. Ken Rawlinson from the RIBA. A question and observation. The question, I'm afraid, is for you again, Jeff. It's really picking up on what you're talking about, which is I wonder to what extent now, and then hence to what extent in the future, record keeping and archiving are part or should become part of architectural training and architectural courses. And a real understanding about what those issues involve, which are really a matter of productivity, if nothing else.
Yeah.
And then the second is just a sort of observation building on what was just being said, which it does seem to me that there's potentially an ideal in the future whereby any publicly funded project or public realm project has a natural or legal expectation that it is self-archiving. And that a sensible place to deposit is identified for that archive. And that would go a long way towards sort of pushing this onus back onto the creators of the data. So thinking with Alex in terms of sort of BIM 4 or BIM 5, building that kind of expectation in.
Well, I think the challenge in education is that we're more or less constantly being pushed to get more and more and more into the curriculum. And so and at some point you start to ask the question, well, okay, what are you going to give up? Now, it would be easy to say, well, you stop teaching CAD and you start teaching BIM. That's not necessarily going to get you what you really need, because BIM is, the wedge diagram is a wedge in other ways, because as soon as you start to take it on board, you do have to start getting much more serious about understanding, in a sense, the nuts and bolts of what's going on under the hood. Yeah, it's not just drawing pictures, it's something much more fundamental than that. I do think it needs to come into education, but I think we need to be very clear about at what point it comes in. At one level, there's something about learning to use the tool. At a different level, and perhaps this is a difference between undergraduate and postgraduate, that you need to start to understand what the larger implications of it are in terms of legalities, facilities management, life cycle, all of those things. And don't forget, the diagram, one of the diagrams that Stuart showed about the BIM model being structural information, lighting information, crowd movement information, all of that. You're also talking about developing an understanding about how you integrate the work of a whole set of other disciplines. Now, that in terms of how you do that in the software is one thing. I think perhaps much more fundamental, and we already push this quite heavily, is I think that students studying architecture have to get a much better understanding about what collaboration really means. I think there's still much of a myth of students coming into undergraduate education that it's Howard Rourke.
Well, it's the
designer,
you make the decision.
isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the goal is to be that.
Yeah,
So.
and I think what we need to strive toward is getting young architects to recognize that design isn't just having the idea. Yeah, design is a process. Design involves collaborating with other people. Whether it's a tiny little project or a mega project, it requires that you have the ability to work very, very effectively with diverse communities again. And there again you get that parallel between what happens in architectural practice and what, as archivists, you need to start to think about is who is that diverse group of practices.
So a bunch of hands went up at the last point. So maybe the lady here first of all.
Sylvia Harris from the Welsh School of Architecture. Do you think then that RIBA visiting boards should have this clarified and be something you're looking for when validating schools of architecture?
But to look for BIM or to look
Well,
for...
just the whole idea of the recording of the design process and well, when they come to part 3, of course, they will have to
Yeah.
BIM.
Well, I think...
Could it be introduced at undergraduate level as well?
I would hesitate to say that it's something the RIBA should look for. I think that the RIBA validation procedures since whenever it was 2007 when they sort of revamped it, and you now have to put forward a statement about what is unique about your program. I think that perhaps that's something that individual schools may say, we're pushing this. For example, Northumbria would absolutely put that forward as being something.
They do look at resources, they assess the resources, they assess the library, and they assess IT.
Yeah, but I think what we're talking about is curriculum focus. Yeah, and some schools may take the approach that says this is absolutely fundamental to our ethos for our school. Others may take a different approach. Yeah, I think it should be taught, but I'm not sure that it should be something that the RIBA comes to evaluate. If you tell the RIBA this is something that's really important and makes this a unique school, then absolutely they should be looking at that to evaluate whether or not you're delivering on what you say. But I think that I worry that it becomes a blanket, and that all schools end up having to have a similar curriculum in certain areas because that's what's expected. And I think there's enough architecture schools in the country that you can have variations on those things.
And the market will help decide that as well.
Yeah.
Martien, can I just very quickly, you had something posted, which is what we're all looking for, which is a digital archivist. Now, it's a position that you're going to be posting.
Yeah.
And I was just curious, because what are your initial thoughts now? Where do you think the ideal candidate, where are they going to come from?
I think still, let's say, from the archivistic realm.
Persuasion,
Yeah. Because, let's say, for our type of work, you know, these two and a couple of others, you need a kind of a structural thinking that perhaps, let's say, people coming from architecture might have, but there's legal issues involved, there are structural issues involved. But what I think is important to have, but actually I'm pretty sure, let's say, a younger generation of archivists already has a lot of knowledge of systems, of how to analyze data and so on. So I'm not so afraid. I mean, I think it's always difficult to get for this very specific niche of architecture. I mean, of course, there's no such thing as a study of architecture archivists. So, but it's a very specific niche, of course, within the archivistic science. So I think, I mean, you will not find this person at once, or people have to be trained or whatever in architecture then. But I think, let's say, it's also, I think, for me, the solution is not the digital archivist. The solution is a team, again, as I said before, because I think the digital archivist, as I think someone with a lot of knowledge, let's say systems, data, that kind of thing, I think that is only adding to a team of people, let's say, like my fantastic assistant who came from architecture school and is very interested in looking back, you know, in all the systems that she has been taught, or our conservator of new media, for example, or
so it's really, I mean,
and at the same time,
people
don't
in
forget that
collections have the skills that you're adding within that kind of thinking.
Yeah, and also again, you said this, I think, at the beginning. A lot of archives will be still very hybrid. So, you know.
Well, this is it. We've now decided we're not going to throw away the paper things, right? I mean, we have that.
Well, I have. You said that. No, of course not. And also, even let's say, if the future is BIM and this future is so sunny and bright, I understand. No, but I mean, still then, I mean, what you acquire from a project can also include a lot of paper models. It might be all BIM, but it might be still...
And in fact, one of the things tomorrow that one of the speakers is going to talk about is what are, my terminology is old-fashioned. There are software programs that allow you to output models, and they use this sort of hard white substance. And this is a huge thing. People want to keep those models, but our conservator Lisa Nash has started now thinking about what are the realities of trying to preserve these materials, because there aren't any standards and nobody's thought about it. So the three-dimensional models in a physical form are still things that, despite the virtual world of creating them, people actually want to hold on to those little maquettes. So they're not going.
I want to get Geoffrey and then I'll get me, Jean, if that's okay.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask Dylan a question, which is that we talked a lot about the kind of acquisition of material. From the point of view of a library, which is you know, traditionally one of the places where people access those archives, what do you see as the challenges for being able to present some of this material to people who come to the library?
That's quite an interesting question. It's probably, if I could answer it, I'd be a very rich man. No, I mean, exactly. The goal is, as increasingly collect more and more different types of items, and it's particularly the case of the British Architectural Library. Although it's called a library, it's more like a museum. We have, as you know, all sorts of material, and kind of the holy grail is to discover, well, what will actually link all those items together. And at the moment, to be honest, I don't know. Is it going to be a totally standardized form of metadata which will stretch from one end to the other? Will the answer come from technology, or as Stuart was mentioning, RDF? That sounds a very interesting technology. So I don't know if that answers your question in terms of that. I don't know,
well,
but
there's even a much more perhaps mundane thing about if we've got CAD drawings and BIM models and JPEGs and all these things, what do I use to access it? Are you going to have a computer that's got Revit and AutoCAD 2001, 2002, 2003, 2000, how are we going to have access to that material to be able to engage with the archive visually, textually, all of those things?
Exactly.
Martien has actually given us a clue, Dylan, because they didn't come, but the IUV in Venice has had a very interesting program about this, and they started with more the hand manipulation of digital files. And one of the fundamental things that they discovered is that you can release normalized things on the web, but when you go to the native CAD files or anything, people have to come to you. And I think Martien has said exactly what, realistically, as Dylan is speaking with us over the drawings collection, we know that we have to have terminals that will have we don't quite know how to do it yet, but partition spaces where people will be able to access the digital files, but not burn them to their own memory state. The control issues, I thank God for normalized things, because that's fine, we all know that. But when you get the architectural historian, or when you get the person that wants to dig deeper with these collections, it's something we have to continue to think through. And I think right now saying they have to come to the institution and access a terminal that is specifically partitioned, etc., is right now the only way that we can comfortably think about potentially.
But this is also telling, because actually I think we are going to expect different type of researchers, because someone said about let's say educating architects in architecture schools, but I'm an art historian. Let's say the classic art historian has no clue about CAD, Maya, Rhino.
Totally.
I didn't have any clue, of course. And it's not being taught at all in architectural history. So let's say the classic research that we at CCA have, and I think a lot of us they will still come and look at books and so on, fine. But we see actually different kind of researchers coming. People from media studies, for example. So let's say they're interested in the bitstream. They're not interested in the aesthetical output of a project, but they're interested in very different, let's say, way of looking. And I think also it's our role to be open to other sciences or other, let's say, groups of people. Because I think in architecture, we're not, let's say, architects themselves are looking for other people to collaborate with as well. So anyway.
Okay, so I'm aware that kind of time's pressing on. I've still got Forrest's hands up though, so you're all still very keen, which I'm pleased to see.
It was really just following on this point, and it goes back to the question I asked earlier, which is that my instinct around this is that this question is why we have to start creating the material straight away, because access to it is just so much more complicated. So I think there's a role on the part of organisations and institutes that are archiving this material to start thinking about who might want to use it, what might be significant to them. Obviously there are huge issues there, because you're prejudging lots of that. But if you don't do that as a way of giving people a way of starting to enter and access the material, you do just end up with a sea of material.
But in a way it's also easier, because
I think both things are true at the same time. But I wanted to build on your point as well, which is that most people who we would want to give access to this data have absolutely no technical expertise at all. So how it is that one presents that data, digital data, digitally to them in a really simple way.
No, but that's their problem. Let's say, if someone doesn't understand an AutoCAD drawing, I don't care. I mean, why should I care about... I can't explain how AutoCAD works to all the different researchers that might be interested.
I think there's potentially a necessity to find a way of presenting an AutoCAD drawing to someone for the first time in a way that they can half understand it. So, for instance...
I mean, there is a requirement in the OAIS for us to speak to the designated community and to ensure that our capabilities are at least in line with their expectations of what it is we're looking at.
So there's no way of saying that we have a duty to interpret in the simplest terms the data.
So it's kind of horses for courses there.
I was just going to say, I would agree with the idea that maybe it's different people who are going to try and access the records for it. Just as an example, with the uni class classification system that I looked at, one of the things I thought I could do was look back at an archive or find an archive where I could see how it was used, so I could do some statistical analysis to see possibly this part of the table is obsolete or this part of these tables are more used than others, but there was no real way.
No.
I'd never been
There's not
asked,
enough data
those
yet.
questions hadn't
Yeah.
been asked before, so I guess it was
Yeah.
never thought that these drawings or these models would be
Yeah.
accessed in that way.
Martien, you started the day.
Well, and I'm struggling now, and in some ways the conversation.
The
is
conversation's
flowing.
gone round in quite a while since
Yeah.
we had it, but
Well, and I'm going back to the sort of basics, and this was sparked by the comment that we're teaching BIM instead of CAD. And it seems to me that's a lot of apples and oranges, that CAD is a software and BIM is conceptual, it's relationships. So how do those, and a related question then goes to the semantic web, which is all about open access to information, where building is essentially a closed process. Very, building information is proprietary, security information. So how does that, I'm sort of trying to see, I don't see it as an either or. I can see BIM as a construct for understanding the building process in the way that eBuilder provides in, an old-fashioned records management sense. So I can get that, but I don't see the either or. So I'm missing something.
Well, I think the main issue is that CAD has typically been a means by which you digitally produce traditional 2D construction drawings. The shift is that in BIM you're working on a single model. This notion of the single model where all the consultants work to the same model.
It's a graphic model or an intellectual model?
It's a
No, it's actually design. It's a
So
design.
there's actually BIM
So you
software.
create drawings.
Yes.
Yes.
There's any number
And it
of them.
exists?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And it
And
has
every-
specification information as
Yeah.
well. Full.
The biggest obstacle for any of us in this is going back to this issue of proprietary. AutoCAD has a proprietary format for BIM. Bentley has a proprietary format. Vectorworks, all of the companies have proprietary formats. As Stuart said, there's the IFC standard that's been developed by Building Smart, which is intended to be an open, interoperable format that and to greater or lesser extent, all of the vendors will output IFC versions of their file data. The problem is that they're all implementing it differently. So you can't come out of Bentley architecture, which is their BIM product, with an IFC and then take it into another piece of software and see the model as it was intended. You lose things in that process. So we have issues about that, and that will become the kind of difficulty for archivists is that if you're not going to keep multiple versions of every software product, you've got a problem about how you get that information out.
So another related question, though, is that I thought that the explanation was that BIM was for the exchange of data. And you just said that
it is in the sense that depending on what data you want to exchange, there are ways in which you can do it.
So you outfload it from the system.
Well, or what you do is, the CIC has a protocol where before you start a project, you get every participant in the project to fill out a set of forms, so you can go across the line and say, okay, I'm using Revit 2012, Revit 2012, Revit 2011. You've got to update your version. You're not even using it, so you've got to buy the software. So we're all using the same software, and therefore we can all collaborate on the project. So
It's like the Peter Eisenman and Ohio State University project, but then at one moment.
Well, so what it really is a software environment that's just more sophisticated and three-dimensional than CAD. With government guidelines.
It's a bit more than that. Well, no, the government guidelines are a separate thing. The fundamental thing is that it's a paradigm shift in the sense that you're not using a digital tool to make drawings. You're using a digital tool to effectively construct a building in 3 dimensions. And every element within the building, within that model, is intelligent. Yeah, it has effectively metadata attached to it. Geometric, quantity, cost, manufacturer, all of that information is held for every piece of the model. Yeah? And therefore you can interrogate that model in ways that you couldn't do with CAD. Yeah? So it's a much more sophisticated, much more complex way of doing things. However, what it leads to is the potential that you can streamline the process in a way that couldn't be done without having something that brings all of that together. But of course, it is the age-old thing that you bring it all together and it just makes 10 times as many questions, and that's where we are.
Okay, I'm going to allow just one more question, if that's okay. Then we'll.
I was just going to say the interesting thing for me would be to find out what does a firm like Frank Gehry do? They must be keeping track of their projects. He's been very heavily. So what are the firms doing that are involved with using BIM? How are they coping with being able to understand and track their records and all of that? There's got to be some answers, or at least some suggestions in that forum that could be carried back.
I think that's a great recommendation for an action to be carried out as a survey project.
Well, Frank Gehry is very simple. Frank Gehry created his own technology company. So, I mean, Gehry Technologies, and we went through his files, his digital files. It's totally accessible. It's upgraded, migrated, everything, all from the early work. That's, let's say, Frank Gehry is the least problem. It's not a problem at all. In terms of the digital files, there are many other problems, but not...
Let's leave it on the theme of lots of problems. Good place to end.
No, but let's say bigger firms. Yeah, no, it's in it. You're just mentioning Gehry, of course. Yeah. But let's say Koolhaas, for example, that's a totally different story. There are already there's archival material at the NIE that is inaccessible. That these very old floppy disks, impossible that we all have, of course, in our archives. No. But let's say it differs. I mean, I'm not sure what the other archives will say, but let's say it differs very, very much from the
honestly, let's leave it there because we're already about 15 minutes over time. Wonder if we could just thank our panelists for a great.